Hello everyone, welcome to our final lecture series of our final lecture of our autumn lecture series. Just before we get started, I'd just like to draw attention to a few health and safety considerations. In the unlikely event the fire alarm goes off, just make your way through this door from which you came, make your way downstairs, and you'll be guided through the gift shop, through a bridge, across the Christchurch Gardens, okay? If you have a mobile phone, just make sure it's switched off or on silent. So I am delighted to present today's speaker, Dr. Mike O'Neill. Mike is an architectural historian and digital archivist. He holds a PhD from Trinity College Dublin in architectural history and criticism and is a member of the Royal Society of Antiquaries. Alongside his many achievements to date, Mike has authored several books and articles that have greatly contributed to our understanding of Ireland's built and architectural past. Most recently, a co-authored book on Dublin Castle through O'Brien Press and an architectural history of the Church of Ireland. He has researched and written on all aspects of Irish architecture and undertaken extensive fieldwork for the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage and the Buildings of Ireland series. So, without further delay, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mike as our final speaker to our autumn lecture series, in which he will discuss the social history of St. Michael's Parish using the first Vestry Minute Book, 1667 to 1754. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mark. So, good afternoon. You can all hear me, yeah? Very good. So, as I say, glad to be back again. Some of you were here last week when I talked, used the Vestry Minute Book to talk about the architecture of St. Michael's Church. And just to remind you where we are in Dublinia, which used to be the Synod Hall, and the tower behind is the tower of St. Michael's Church. So what I'm going to be doing today is, last week I actually used the first Vestry Minute Book to extract it for information about rebuilding the church of St. Michael's. In fact, I used the first, second, and third Vestry Minute Book because the third building is from the early 19th century. So let's see, where are we here? Okay, so today I'm going to talk more about the parish and the social history of the parish, again using the lens of the Vestry Minute Book, and I'll have to explain a bit about what a Vestry Minute Book is and what it'll tell you and what it won't tell you. So that's an important aspect of what I can do in this talk today. So the first thing is to give you some idea of the extent of St. Michael's Parish within the city of Dublin. It's the area in pink here. This is using OpenStreetMaps. I don't know if any of you use them. They're absolutely fabulous. It's a freely available resource, and people have done a lot of work overlaying different areas on top of a map. So you can see here that the parish goes from the quays, basically the Adam and Eve's Franciscan Friary is basically the southern end of it. Sorry, the northern end of it. It comes up here beside St. Audwin's. That's Schoolhouse Lane, St. Audwin's Terrace, which are artisan cottages that are there now. Bowers Court, there's still a sign for it. And then the parish actually crossed the road. So it came up here. There's a slight kink here, and I will show you why that is in a second. The parish actually extended across High Street to incorporate what is now Taylor Hall Guild, is that end of it, and came a little bit around to basically behind High Street. There were a number of courts there, and then came back here and included just a few houses on Skinner Row, and then came back around to the front. So it was a parish, a small enough parish within the city. To the left is St. Audwin's, which stretches that way. This is St. John the Evangelist. So if you just exclude the Christchurch bit, this is St. John the Evangelist parish. The church was just about there. Okay, about twice the size of St. Michael's. So, this is a view from the tower looking down at, basically, this is what we have in the 21st century, like 2 weeks ago. Looking down the parish of St. Michael's from the top of the tower. And this is a better view. This is actually wonderful, I think probably late 1950s aerial picture. And don't want to be in your way there. You see Christchurch here, yeah? Here we are in Dublinia with the bridge. So this stretches the whole way down to the river, back up here, Schoolhouse Lane, slightly across the road here and back along here. And you get a real sense here of Wine Tavern Street. The way up onto, when you come up the street, actually it's been adjusted that the street basically comes up under the bridge there. You probably noticed that if you've driven up or walked up. In the past, it basically butted almost, it was stopped by the nave of Christchurch, if you know what I mean. And there was a road here called Cockhill, of all things, which went across the road to John's Lane, which is at the back of, or the north side of Christchurch, to give you that sense. So that is the extent of the parish. So obviously everything there, almost everything there is 19th, 20th century, but we're looking obviously at the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, which is slightly different. But to give you some sense of what it looked like. And of course here is all Woodkey, as we all know, where the council offices are now, and where all the architectural digging went on in the 70s and 80s, and of course, to a large extent, Dublinia is one of the outcomes of that of our medieval heritage in Dublin. So last week I talked about the fact that we looked at the extent of the parish, that there was a medieval church with a tower in the parish, that in the 1670s it was rebuilt, possibly I would imagine reuse a fair bit of the masonry that was there. The tower was certainly rebuilt. The reason I say that, I think it reused a lot of the previous building is because it fell down 100 years later. And if you were building a brand new building in the 1680s, you'd expect it would last longer than 100 years. So I think they reused quite a bit of the medieval foundations, and it was on a very peaty site, so I think there were dangers inherent in that. And then just to set the scene a little bit more, this is a later church. This church was finished in 1815, started in 1810, a sort of first fruits church. And across here you're seeing Christchurch, and this is down Christchurch Hill down to Wine Tavern Street. But what you have in here, and if you were here last week, you remember this, that's the remains of the forecourts. The forecourts were in Christchurch Place, in the cloisters of Christchurch from the 16th century, 17th century onwards until 1800, when they moved down to Inskey, so across the river. So they were actually in there, the forecourts, quite extraordinary in a way. But that is relevant to what I want to say in a minute. So, and this last picture, this is what the first fruits church, the 1815 church, looked like. Quite a small church, this massive tower from the earlier church, still here. So if you imagine where we are is incorporated all in front of that building. Does that make sense? That was taken down in the 1870s when they disestablished the Church of Ireland. There was an issue as to whether Christchurch would be kept as a cathedral in Dublin, a second cathedral, because they already had St. Patrick's. And one of the things that actually pushed them to keep Christchurch as well was that Henry Rowe, the distiller, had undertaken to pay for the restoration of Christchurch, and he also undertook to build a synod hall for the Church of Ireland in its disestablishment phase or era. So this is our famous rope map from 1756 that we can't live without, and it ties in very well. It ties in at the end of our first Vestry Minute Book. So this is what it would look like for the last 100 pages of the Vestry Minute Book. And again, I won't labour the point, but Wine Tavern Street, as you say, came up here. John's Lane went across the road to what was called Cockhill. That's basically gone now. But Borough Court is still there. If you go down, when you come out of the way you come into Dublinia, well, you are basically coming in somewhere around here, somewhere really. And if you go, that street's much shorter now. These buildings have all been taken away largely, okay? And Borough Court you can still see, up Michael's End, and across is here. There is the Taylor's Hall there. Okay, so does that make sense? And what you have is you've got some infills in here, or you've got courts in here and courts in here, which I will talk about in a second. So, and finally, the last map, and I won't even dwell on it, is the Brooking map from about 20 years earlier, 1720 or so. But it does show the outline of the parish. And the interesting thing is that it kinks in. It doesn't actually, it comes down about halfway. It never quite reaches Wine Tavern Street. And then it seriously kinks in there to give a very narrow footprint on Merchant's Quay. So, and this, I won't dwell on this, but this is published in the Irish Builder. The Irish Builder in the 1890s produced a huge series of articles on both, on several of the inner city parish churches, and in fact there's a whole series of published accounts from the Vestry Minute Book, which was done in the 1890s, and they also, before the forecourts went up with the with all the records of all the records that were kept there, there were also registers which they published in the Irish Builder. But they included this map. It doesn't go over here, what you should do to give us full sense, but you get this notion here of inner courts, for example. Anyway, I'll look at those. So there's Burr Court there, there's Cockhill. So just another view of everything that's going on there. So this Vestry Minute Book, the first Vestry Minute Book, I didn't include a picture, I should have. It's a big enough volume, okay? What's interesting about it, and it's been rebound, two things are really interesting about it. One is a little bit, I suppose, slightly negative. It starts on page 27. So we're missing the first 27 pages. That's unfortunate. In fact, and I'll tell you what we're missing in a second. The other thing that's really interesting about it is you will find in the Vestry Minute Book actually references to itself, which is quite extraordinary. So you have dated things, and it says, including this book. So this book was bound, it was bought as a bound book. Sometimes we think that these books were on loose paper and then bound at the end. It looks like this book was actually bought as a big, blank sheet paper, a bit like something you'd buy at Christmas for a kid, sort of a little book that's got a nice cover in it, but this is a big one. And what seems to be the case is what's happening is that it's very formal documents are written in this book, and they're signed. So it's already an artifact as it's been used over the 100 years that it exists. That people, it's taken out at the beginning of a meeting. I'll talk about this in a minute. And everybody knows that we are here, and we're 2/3 way through this book, so that we've been using this book for 100 years. So you have to take what you're doing here seriously, because we have this record of it. But anyway, it begins basically with a list of streets, a partial list, so it begins in folio 29, and it enumerates people, and these people are people who are house owners on each of these streets. So on Cook Street 24, Merchant's Quay 17, 8 on Michael's Lane, 8 on Cockhill, and 10 on Church Lane. And at the end of the period, and the beginning of the next Vestry Minute Book, so 1756, which is the same as our rope map, so with a century later basically, you can see that what they seem to have missed out, they missed out on Skinner Row and High Street is the main guess. But you can see Skinner Row 5 houses, High Street 62 houses, McCullough Court. These are all behind High Street, okay? And what they're doing basically is these have all names against them. Maybe this will maybe show you what I mean by that. You see here, that says here, Cook Street. And here list of names, householders, okay? And this is a valuation of their house. And the same here. We're missing the previous couple of pages, which would have been High Street. And this is the later one, 1756. Again, you can see High Street, a list of the names and valuations. So what they're doing, this is what they're starting to do in the 17th century, is they're valuing properties house by house in Dublin, and they're going to use it for some reason or other. Before I get on to that, counting people is a serious occupation in 17th century Ireland. When you think about the Down Survey maps and the Civil Survey, everybody was interested in who was living where, what they were doing, and the transfer of land during the whole Cromwellian or Commonwealth period. This huge transfer of land to adventurer soldiers from out of Catholic hands for rewards for being here during the Cromwellian or Commonwealth period, whichever you like. And this is just at the very end of the if you think of that, in 1660, you have the restoration of James II, the Restoration period it's called. This is just before that. And it's a list again of names of people in the streets in Dublin. This one is published in 1940s or so. But what's interesting here is you have the number of people as counted, as well as the names that count the number of people here. These are English people living here, and these are Irish people living here. So you can see why they're already interested in how many Irish are in Dublin, as well as how many English are in Dublin. What you'd have to suggest, I haven't added up these numbers, but I think this is about 20% are Irish, I think, when I did the sum before. If you think about it, 20% of people living in St. Michael's Parish in 1659 are Irish, they would, for their own health and safety, would have had to leave Dublin when Cromwell came in 1649. Because if you think what happened, he went to Drogheda and he went to Wexford and did what we would now, in now terms, we would call ethnic cleansing. If the Catholics had stayed in Dublin, Dublin would have been the third, almost certainly would have been the third city that would have been ruthlessly destroyed. So the Irish, which I think for Irish you can read Catholic there, to be honest with you, population had left all these parishes, I think, in the early Cromwellian period. And they're probably drifting back as time goes on. And that's what you're beginning to see here. This, again, is around the same time, 1663. In this case, what they're doing is they're counting the number of hearths. So the number of fireplaces in your house gives you, if you've got 16 fireplaces, you're in a bigger house than somebody's got 2. So that's how they're working this out. I think what's really interesting here is the house with the biggest number of fireplaces, well, there's 2 of them, but I just saw the second one there. In 1663 is the Earl of Kildare has 8 houses in has got 8 hearths in St. Michael's Parish. The Earl of Kildare is where Taylor's Hall is there. It used to be in the 1620s, the Jesuits were there. Do you remember? And then they were moved out and they came back and stuff. But I think that's where that is. It's on High Street or behind High Street. And then there's another one over here which I just spotted, which also Henry Warren also lives in a fairly serious house. What they're doing all this time is they're valuing properties, money allotted. Okay, so they're saying that this house, Earl of Kildare's house, is worth £16 per annum. Okay, so what they're going to do basically, for all sorts of different reasons, is they are going to find a way of plotting using this valuation for houses to do rateable valuations for all sorts of different things. And we're going to be talking about the Church of Ireland. So the 2 things they're going to be doing is they're going to be doing what we call cessus, looking for money for either the clergy or for running the parish. So this is how you do it, and I'll come back to that in a second. So this is a map that I took out of Rowena Dudley, who did a lot of work on Vestry Minute books back a while ago now. Looked at an awful lot of them, and this just gives you a sense of how small St. Michael's is in terms of the relation to other parishes in the city. And Vestry Minute books haven't been ignored completely. I'm making it sound like they're a new discovery. They aren't really. They've been well published. There's been a whole series done over the last 25 years of actually transcribing these Vestry Minute books, doing an introduction and also including a index at the back. So they're very, very valuable ones. The point I'm making here is that St. Michael's one hasn't been done, and we're hoping to do it here within Dublinia within the next year. So we will, I've more or less finished transcribing it. I have to do introduction, then hopefully we publish it. So we include St. Michael's as the other parish. So if you think of, where am I here? Most of these are done, basically is what I'm saying, and the one that's the outlier at the moment is St. Michael's. So hopefully we'll get that one published sooner rather than later.
So what does
Yes.
this mean without St. Nicholas within walls?
Within the walls, I beg your pardon. Yeah, within the walls, without the walls. So outside the walls, St. Nicholas without and St. Nicholas within. So that is really my introduction. It's a long introduction, isn't it? And I'll be much quicker now. So a parish as small as St. Michael's, how can it survive? Well, it's in the city of Dublin, and where it is in the city of Dublin, it is quite densely packed, we saw from those lists of houses, but you also have the forecourts, which were in Christchurch, which I showed you a while ago. You have the customs houses down on the quays, not down in far down the quays, just down here on Essex Quay, and also you have the Tolsil where the administration of the city is going on. So basically, you have this petition in 1683. The Roe was threatening to move the forecourts away from where they were and put them somewhere else. And you see that people were saying that the land around St. Michael's and in areas, places have always been of considerable value. They are now properties laid out, building improving of the same. Many are set to lawyers, attorneys, and solicitors. The houses in the heart of the city are set to either lodgings to preachers, solicitors or suitors, or keepers of taverns, victualling or alehouses for supply of them. If the courts are removed, this is always a danger. From the heart of the city, this area will be left destitute and families left undone. Now, in fact, the courts didn't move for until 1800, so this was an early, possibly slightly worried a little bit, generations too early. But one of the, what many of the parishes had is they actually owned property in all these parishes, and actually in the Vestry Minute Book, at the back of it, there is a big parchment which gives a list of what is owned by St. Michael's Parish, what the church owns within the parish. And here's basically 2 to 6, which is a lot of their properties are actually off Wine Tavern Street and on Cock Hill. So basically, just below Christchurch, but on the other side of the road. Does that make sense? So they own all these properties here. And what they're able to do is every year they are able to charge ground rent on these. It's called the ancient income, or the ancient properties of the parish. And it's one of their income sources that they have every year. And this is actually the survey of the land. So this is the document that's folded into the back of the Vestry Minute Book, and apparently it's documented in the Vestry Minute Book that every year when church wardens were sworn in, this was read out to them so that they would know what the parish actually owned. Because the danger is that people forget. People like Boyle made his money out of Richard Boyle, the first Earl of Cork, made a lot of money out of discovering properties that had gone missing and getting leases on them. So this is one way of making sure that you kept your properties. And also you have here, interesting enough, the Corpus Christi Religious Guild, which survives the post-Reformation period, and also another guild that are involved, I'm not sure if it's on this list or not, is the Shoemakers Guild. They're involved with St. Michael's Parish. So, I mentioned this already about minister money. So basically all that stuff early on about valuing houses, you're valuing houses, you're saying they're worth, £10 or £20. In 1666, again after the Restoration, when St. Andrew's Parish had been set up, they created new legislation called minister money. So what you did was you did a valuation of all the houses in the parish, and then you got a valuation of, say, 20, 30, £10. Nothing could be valued more than £60. That was one of the rules. And then what you could do is you could do a shilling in the pound valuation was collected every year for the minister's money, for the clergyman in the parish, from everybody. It wasn't just Church of Ireland. It was Catholics and Presbyterians and any other dissenters of any sort. Everybody was obliged to pay this. And you had things now, they don't survive for St. Michael's. All that survives for St. Michael's are the 4 Vestry Minute Books. Everything else was possibly in the forecourts and destroyed. But there were then, you ended up with parish allotment books where you actually took one of those lists we had earlier and you calculated out how much you were going to assess the population to collect minister money. And the same thing then was once you had, and they used to do it every 3 or 4 years, they would reassess the value of houses in the parish, and then you could revalue then whether it was worth more or less when you went and collected the cess. And that was the function really of the church warden. I won't go into this too much, but you do need to understand a few of these terms to be able to properly read a Vestry Minute Book. and you had church wardens. A lot of these people, the Irish canons of 1634, they're the church canons when the Church of Ireland was redefining itself in the early 17th century. And a lot of these people, there were two types of people involved in running the parish. You had general vestry and select vestry. I don't know if any of you are familiar with those terms. They're still used certainly still used in the Church of Ireland. And I think vestries are they're talking about vestries more in the Catholic Church as well now. Basically, they were the people who ran the parish along with the clergyman. And you had the clergyman. There were men back then always. And then you have what people call church wardens. So they were actually responsible for keeping the parish running over the year, that they didn't overspend their budget, that the church didn't close down on while they were in charge. And they basically did a term for a year. In St. Michael's, there were two clergymen, or there were two church wardens. There were what's called the upper church warden and the accountant church warden. The accountant church warden was responsible for doing the accounts at the end of the year to show what came in and what went out. So there were two church wardens elected. Then there were two sidesmen elected, who their job really was to, initially or in theory, was to go around the parish saying, "Why aren't you in church on Sunday?" The second thing was to sort of keep a bit of order in the church. Now, I don't think that was probably much of an issue anyway. And we know in St. Michael's, both the church wardens and the sidesmen were responsible for collecting the cess. Now that isn't an easy thing to do. What you're doing is you've decided that somebody's house is worth £10, and you're going to say you're going to 1 shilling in the pound, so that's 10 shillings minister money, and then you decide you're going to have a poor cess, and I'll come to that in a second, of sixpence in the pound. So you're going around to people's houses and you're looking for 15 or 18 shillings every year, which is fine if you go to St. Michael's Parish, Church of Ireland Parish. If you don't, you still have to pay this money. So it wasn't, I'd imagine they weren't particularly popular. And we see at different times where it becomes unpopular. But that's how they funded the clergyman, and also what they called the poor cess. The poor cess was money that was collected every year for actually the poor within the parish. Now it's slightly more complicated than that. I'll come back to it. But what I want to just say here is this is an example from a vestry. A general vestry was held every Easter week. So basically, the beginning of the church year was the beginning of the church year ran from Easter to Easter, and you elected new church wardens and new sidesmen every year. But you have a whole other series of people here. So the first two are on top there. You can see the Richard Reeves and George Warburton are elected the church wardens. Okay, and at the end of that sentence, you can see Thomas Wiseman and Richard Warren are elected as sidesmen and collectors for the poor of the parish. And in between, you have a whole set of people who are also in this parish, and they're actually on our list on the first page that survives and on some of the other documentation, who are basically, they are appointed auditors of any four of them. So you've got these people who are watching what has been coming in and out of the church. So it has been very well managed, that sort of like, in theory, the money shouldn't be gone missing in any shape or form, that what comes in is spent, and we'll see what it's spent on, and if it's not been spent, then it goes into the parish chest and it's handed over to the church wardens for the next year. Need to go back here. One of the things that the church wardens are responsible for is this sort of stuff to have in the church, that you have a silver flagon for the wine, a chalice for communion, pewter flagons, plates, cloth for the altar, a surplice, Holland cloth surplice, minister's hood, because the clergy at this stage were all graduates of Trinity anyway, a cushion for the pulpit, and all this stuff. Book of evidence, and this is interesting here, the book of assessments besides this book. So in 1673, in this book that we have, it's saying this is me. You know, the book's not saying anything, but basically, you know what I'm saying. This is somebody's writing this in the book. And what's really interesting is even at this stage, the parish is responsible for fire safety in the parish. So what they have is they have 36 old buckets, 2 old ladders, and 1 iron crow. And this is what they did. The iron crow were huge bars that went up and they just pulled either the gables off or pull the roofs off to try and stop fire. And you see this. And 36, they're leather buckets. In fact, you see them often from year to year repairing the leather buckets and buying new crows. And the ladders, one ladder is 36 steps, the other is 18 steps, all this sort of stuff. But they already have that function within the parish of putting out fires. And you can imagine, I think it's in 1660 that the Corporation of Dublin banned the using of thatch. There was a thatched house went on fire in James's Street, and they said, no more thatched houses in the city. It's too crowded, it's a disaster. You basically have open fires anyway in these houses, don't you? Like it's not enclosed, it's not closed and gas stoves like we have now. And if you have thatch roofs, you're in danger of these things happening. Okay, register book for baptisms and burials. And again, you often have a parish clerk who's employed to do that. Okay, let me keep moving here. Okay, and here we have, I was saying that, so you have the minister money, and you also have what's called the poor cess, and the poor cess generally is certainly early on, it's six pence in the pound valuation for houses. And that is used for the poor of the parish. But what they do, it's not simply a case of you queue up if you were unlucky enough to be one of the poor of the parish. They actually make a list of who they consider to be the deserving poor in the parish, which I would say we'd consider a bit problematic now, but this is what they do. So they're given that much money per week, and that works out at that amount per pound. So basically what they're saying is that in 1674, they would have done a poor cess on the parish of £32. So they would have calculated back from the values of each house what they could rate on them to make up £32. And that would have to be collected as well as the minister money. So they're not, I wouldn't say they're very popular people, but they are the, what you find is the description that people say is that the church wardens and the sidesmen and the auditors, all the other people, they're what would be considered, and I think they're called the middling sort. So they're not the incredibly wealthy in the parish, and they're not the particularly poor in the parish. They're sort of what we would call the middle class now, aren't they, basically? You know, it's what they would be. So they have an interest in the stuff, and they have enough standing in terms of their own, what they do for a living, that have enough standing in the parish that when they call to your door once or twice a year, well, you know that this is, we do it now. I mean, except the government takes the money directly from us, so we don't feel as, well, they don't for church stuff, but they do for everything else. But you have faces in this case. So it's a difficult job. So you can see why sometimes people, when they're elected, and the word isn't, they don't really use the word elected. They sort of, it's a more subtle thing. Sometimes people decide they don't want to be church wardens, and they pay fines of £5 or £6 or £10 to be taken out of the job, so they don't have to do it. Now that's a lot of money to come in. So you can sort of say, oh well, he's not going to do that. But here's, you know, we've got £8 extra for this year. And some people, I mean, obviously their jobs wouldn't, and some people were exempt from doing it anyway. So I showed you that one. So here we go again. Here's another poor list, because I suppose it's sort of social history. And again, you get a list here of people. Now, interestingly enough, included with the poor list was the beadle. The beadle was the man who went around the parish, basically keeping things in order. And his job was also, so here the beadle is paid out of the same poor cess that's collected on the parish. So it's funny, isn't it? Peter Sexton as beadle. So, you know, obviously he's somewhere back in his past, there were sextons, these family were sextons. He becomes the beadle. And the beadle basically it does a certain amount of sort of social control in the parish, but he also does more interesting more important things. Is if he hears that there are foundlings in the parish, you know, children that have been either left or abandoned or can't be looked after by their birth mother. He's involved in finding them wet nurses. And there are other lists later on, which I haven't included here. You have lists of about 10 or 12 wet nurses who have been paid £2 or £3 a year. So their job is to when they're foundlings in the parish, they bring them up for the first year or two. So so this is what a lot of what the poor cess is used for. Now, so in terms of, I was saying to you there near the beginning about how in the late 1650s, a lot of Catholics would have just left Dublin. The danger is that they would, the pogrom could have been in Dublin as opposed to in Drogheda and in Wexford, and they were drifting back. Now, sort of the table slightly turned in 1685 when Charles II died, King of England and Ireland at that stage, and replaced by his was it his brother, James II, who of course was Catholic, or his wife was Catholic. I've forgotten the exact details. But you suddenly had Tyrconnell was the Lord Lieutenant. So you had a slight turning of the tide of what's going to happen. Is the nation going to stay purely Protestant in Dublin, or what's going to happen? And you have one of the things that happens is that the Parliament actually gets rid of the Minister Money Act, so that suddenly these clergymen have to find some other way of being remunerated. And you see here that the parish, out of its own coffers, so they have enough money in the coffers to actually pay the clergyman this year. Okay, and also to pay the parish clerk £5. The parish clerk is the man who, when the service is going on, he does the responses in the Book of Common Prayer, if you're familiar with it. The responses are done by the clerk so that the population in general don't have to answer the responses. And also the parish clerk was responsible for leading the psalms. And you have all these wonderful stories about parish clerks who couldn't sing properly, trying to lead the congregation and everybody falling around the place, and often been sort of removed from office very quickly because they were considered to be just making a whole mockery of the whole thing. Who am I thinking of? His name will come to me in a second. Somebody talked about being in a parish church in London, and for evensong, the afternoon service on a Sunday, and because the parish clerk was leading the psalm singing, it took them 3 hours to get through the psalm, because he would lead with a line and then the whole congregation would respond, and then the next line and the next line. Can you imagine? Anyway, his name will come to me when this is all over. So the second thing that happened is in 1690, when you're, lead up to the Battle of the Boyne and then the Battle of Aughrim, is you have all distressed Protestants who are living outside Dublin city, where it's less safe, there are less numbers of them, and they're actually coming back into the city. They have been robbed and stripped of their goods and have in a naked and miserable condition repaired to the city for refuge and relief. And you can see here again we have people like Henry Aston is going to collect for them in Skinner's Row. John Coyne is going to do St. Michael's Lane, Christchurch Lane in Cockhill, and Mr. William Mitchell in Cook Street. And what's interesting here is you can see at the second half of this, in likewise, so they're going to collect to enter fairly in a parchment schedule. So they're going to use the same principle, I suppose, as they did for cessing. Together with each particular person's name, who shall give the same. And likewise in the same schedule, to mention ye names of such persons, as well Papists as Protestants, so Catholics as well as Protestants, who being able will contribute nothing for the relief of this distress therefore mentioned. So a long memory been written down in this book here. It's what, and there was, suddenly, we talked about the Restoration period from 1660 to 1680s, and then you have, after 1690, you have the ascendancy period, where it really becomes sort of, as we all know, it becomes sort of a Protestant country, very much so, in the ascendancy period after 1690. So, this is the one thing I haven't shown you, and I haven't got that many more slides, so don't worry. This is what the accounts look like for any particular year in the Vestry Minute Book. Okay, so the first thing to see there is the second line there. The cash. There's already cash of £56 in the parish chest. So you know, in the early 18th century, things are going well here. On the next three, Mr. Pitts, William Witchett, and Alderman Coyne, and Mr. Street, they are serious amounts of revenue from ground rent, and they're what are called the ancient revenues. This is the land that's owned by the parish. So they get this money every year, unless things are very bad. Now, during the couple of years during the 5 year period I was talking about, between 85 and 90, 1685 and 1690, some of these didn't pay their money. But these are the ancient revenues, so that's a good start to any year. And then if you see a little bit further down, Greshingham's use of the wall of 2 shillings and 6pence, so somehow he's using some part of the church, leaning up against it. Corpus Christi Guild, so there's religious guild, they're still theoretically collecting 15 shillings every year from this religious guild. Sabbath day collection, so as well as the assessing, they're obviously collecting money at church services on Sunday. And you begin to see things like they're starting to have charity sermons, preachers, readers, all sorts of things going on. Interesting there, Sabbath breaking and swearing. We'd all be responsible for that, wouldn't we, sometimes? And then received by cess. So the cess that year was for £19, 16 shillings. And also another source of income was burials. Okay, see the one there for Mrs. Aston's 13 shillings and 6pence a mark, or 4pence. That's been buried in the church. It's cheaper to be buried outside the church, okay, in the churchyard. So that's what the income that's coming in, okay, and it's 161. And you know, this because they're accountants, this will all add up on the other side. And then what they're spending on the other side, it's harder to see, I'm sure, from where you are, because the font is lower. But basically, I can't see it myself. The usual things, okay? You have a second clergyman called Mr. William Jackson. This sounds like a band here. Mr. Jones, Mr. Tars, Mr. Hayes, and Mr. Stilling, you know. They're actually things like readers and what are they? They certainly have roles in the church that they didn't have earlier. A secret service, yeah, that comes up every once in a while. Whatever that's about, it seems to be either going off and finding out about somebody, or doing something for the parish, or dealing with the Tolsel or something like that. This is sort of the sad stuff. A coffin for the said child, and this child who was murdered. So this, you know, nothing changes, I suppose. The glaze here for glass. Let's see, what are serious ones? For bread for the poor. Okay, that's somebody gave a donation like that. If you go down to St. Anne's Church in South Anne Street, off Dawson, what's it called? Dawson Street. You know where in there you have the still have the bread loaves. So this is the same thing done in this parish, where I think Mr. Quinn, I think it was it Quinn? Anyway, it doesn't matter. In perpetuity gave £2, 12 shillings every year for bread for the poor. You know, so it would have been put up inside the church, presume on a Sunday, and people could come in and collect it. Let's see, where else do we have? Okay, the poor out of the Sabbath day collections. So I think this is possibly where they're actually just giving money at the end of the church service, as opposed to their poor list. Okay, subpoena in London. So somebody's going to go, somebody's scarpered for some reason, and they're going off to try and get them in London. Cash lodged in the parish chest, so they're doing well here. Now, this is interesting. This is social history. Mr. Hayes for carrying away the dirt, and for maps, and for whiskey. And you're saying, why is this man getting whiskey? This is the poor man who is, they've got a tiny graveyard beside St. Michael's. It's still here. Well, the graveyard's gone. And there are too many people in the graveyard. So every once in a while, somebody would have the job of clearing the graveyard of bones, basically. Where they put them, I don't know. And then he would do another map of saying who was where in the graveyard. And then this was often done at night time. So if you were going out and digging in a graveyard night, and you'd probably want to be fortified by some whiskey. So you do get some social history in these. They're very formulaic, so you have to actually go looking at the individual lines, to actually get the social history. Because nobody's going to actually write up and say, well, we had an awful time that time, and the time we dug out the graveyard. Nobody's going to do that, but that's what's going on. And this is an example of, they're accountants, so it works out exactly. I probably missed a half penny over there when I was transcribing this, not them. So that gives you a sense of, so these Vestry Minute books are quite formal. So you have the clergy, so you have the church warden's been appointed, you have looking after the poor lists, and then you have the accounts from one end of the year to the other. So this goes on year in, year out. The exceptions, and we talked about it last week, is when you have to go and rebuild your church. So for example, in the late 1670s, they had to raise cesses at the end of £900. So can you imagine being assessed £900 on the parish? It would have been a shocking amount of money, sort of, the church you don't go to, I need you to give me £15, please. I don't know how they managed to do it, but they did. By 1714, they're talking about setting up a charity school in the parish, and how they would pay for it using afternoon collections and things like that, charity sermons, etc., etc. Yes? Sure, Grant. That'll be perfect. Okay, so you can see this is sort of the ascendancy period moving in fairly rapidly. Okay. Also, what also happens in the 18th century is the parishes, they're running themselves. They're looking after fire in the parish, so they're responsible for. They eventually get fire engines, which I'll show you before we finish. They also are given extra tasks by the Lord Mayor or by government, and one of the things is to regulate the watch in the parish, so that it's safe to traipse around the parish, coming up to dusk or during the day. So you create a watch, and again, the same principle applies where whoever are going out and collecting the cess, they also have to collect a cess for people on the watch, and they create constables of the watch. And there's a whole section, whole pages on continual pages over the several years between this and the end of the book of nominating constables for the watch, and the Lord Mayor would say, no, not him, no thanks, not him. So they somebody might have a good reputation in their own parish, and outside their own parish they're not considered suitable. The other thing again is that you see here in 1726, you see that Dublin is expanding, and even within, so it's expanding way outside the walls, obviously, and south and north of the river. But even within the confines of a parish like St. Michael's, you do have a lot of either they're rebuilding houses, or they're knocking down one house and building 3 or 4, But what they're doing is they're valuing these houses here that are new houses in the parish. And what they're saying is this is what they reckon that the people who've built these houses, so this new house by William Cruikshank, he possibly isn't going to live in it, but he is going to rent the house. And they reckon that it's rent per annum of £10, which so they can do a rate of evaluation on that of 1 shilling in the pound, so 10 shillings before you start. And it's interesting that he's a shoemaker, isn't it? Because it's the Guild of Shoemakers are in St. Michael's. And this list goes on and on. You can see it's done by McCullough Court, which is behind High Street, Angel Alley also behind High Street, and then let's see, where do you have Rosemary Lane down to the Quays. So they're going around constantly reevaluating what's going on in the parish. And the other thing that happens, again, as I said to you, they keep adding functions to what we would now call local government, I suppose, for the parishes to do. And then they start talking about, in 1739, about erecting lamps, so having lanterns in the parish, so that after dark you're not, if you're going to be murdered, at least you're murdered well, there's a light, so you can see yourself dying. So that's 1739. It actually takes a whole decade almost, 1749, before it's implemented. And then you can see what they do in High Street, Plough Alley and Angel Alley. 9 lamps. Parish are responsible for that. In Borough Court, which is on this side of the of High Street. Cook Street further down, Merchants Quay. So total of 27 lamps. So they're going to have to pay for these, maintain them. They have to have lamp lighters. So they have watches. They have a whole set of constables. Again, what they talk about offices of burden and offices of profit. And the offices of burden were what the church wardens and the sidesmen did. They were doing this for the good of their souls, or for, I suppose they were, and for their standing in the parish in a sense as well. And then the offices of profit were the ones like sextons and beadles who actually got paid for their job, but still were responsible and necessary. So here is a watchman with his staff to protect himself. Fire buckets, I think in the 1720s there is a mention of buying a Parish engine, which I think must be a fire engine in St. Michael's Parish. Something like this. So instead of having buckets, you have a machine that you fill with water and you can pump it out. And these two you may recognise. They're in the foyer of St. Michael's and St. Werburgh's, or Warburg as they used to call it back in the day. They're still there, still exist. Nearly there, folks. So this is looking down St. Michael's Lane, and here I'm just looking across the road from looking at Dublinia and looking here at down St. Michael's Lane and the Tower of St. Michael's. And we get a sense, and we saw earlier in some of those aerial photographs, or if they weren't aerial, they were close enough. How, I suppose, in a sense, how widespread the population is now. Or sorry, there's quite a bit of room. It isn't hugely overpopulated, but you have to remember this is what it looked like. This is Cook Street. This is going to be 1880s. And this is Michael's Lane up from Cook Street. And that is Skipper Alley off Merchants Quay. So you can see, I suppose you can talk about in Dublin people talk about the rare old times. I'm not sure how rare they were. Do you know what I mean? If you were living through times like that. What was I just going to, if I can find it here? Yeah, so basically, to give you a sense of I suppose, what the Vestry Minute Book does and what it doesn't do, it's very good at giving you a sense of how this parish ran itself. And you get a lot of social history out of it. But then you have to remember that you're just looking at one aspect of the parish. And if you look at, again within our period, the 1731 report on the state of popery in Ireland, okay? So when they talk about the inner city parishes, they say for St. Michael's that there was one Catholic church and one rebuilt since the first of George I, so since 1715 or thereabouts. There are 6 priests in each of these parishes. That's an extraordinary number of clergymen when you think about it. I mean, they have 2 or 3 Church of Ireland clergymen, so they have 6 priests in each of these parishes. And on top of that, they have 7 schools. So there's this whole other system going on in plain sight, because, of course, the one man who forgot that there was only one state religion in the country was Roke in his maps, and nobody told Roke not to put in the Catholic churches. So when you look at Roke's map, of course you see every denomination, and we saw it earlier when we looked at Roke on down in Merchants Quay. He was showing the St. Adam and Eve Church already in place, and a few others. So that's one way you can count they call them mass houses as opposed to churches in that stage. But so basically there are 2, if not 3, different systems going on in this parish. A lot of the functions have been run by the Church of Ireland parish, and they eventually, in the 19th century, are gradually taken over by either corporation or by central government. But what you'd have to say is, without them, it would have been, what's that great phrase? Is it luck about without this sort of vigilance and looking after the parish, life would have been solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. So there you are. So thank you very much indeed.
Wow. Thank you, Mike. A lot of taxes.
A lot of taxes.
lot of
yeah,
taxes.
a lot of taxes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd imagine quite unpopular as well, but you'd have no choice, you
Mm.
know. Now, whether I was trying to think about this in the way, and perhaps, you know, if you were renting a house, maybe the cess was bundled into the rent, and then the house owner paid it. So it may have been like that. It may not have been like called into your door, but it could have been called into your door twice a year or 4 times a year, depending on whether they did it that way. Yeah.
Absolutely excellent talk. An incredible example of the amount of evidence and narrative that we can glean from looking at primary documents. We have time for 1 or 2 quick questions. Does anyone have a question for Mike?
I'm just wondering, how large was the graveyard? Do we know where the footprint
Oh
for
yeah,
that was?
you can see it in a Roke's map. It's tiny.
Right.
It's tiny.
But
And
like in today's terms.
oh gosh, I think it's probably on the site. You know where you come in here?
Yeah.
You know where the local that's the graveyard.
That's
there.
it?
That's it. Yeah.
Wow.
It was tiny. You have references in the Vestry Minute Book of looking for places elsewhere to bury their dead, but they never seem to succeed in finding another place. It'd be difficult enough.
Yeah.
And when you think about when they developed Stephen's Green, there were 4 plots for graveyards. Do you remember, instead of houses, like down where the College of Physicians is, that was a graveyard, Quaker graveyard, wasn't it?
Okay.
And there was another one up beside, what's the little narrow street when you're heading up towards Marion Row? Wasn't there another one in there? Yes.
Still there, yeah.
Still there, yeah. So it was a huge issue. And of course that was only solved in the 19th century when you built the park graveyards, you know, or the garden graveyards like Mount Jerome and Glasnevin. Yeah.
I should be able to, I think you'll hear me. Just on the poor list, a lot
Yeah.
of the names people receiving, they seem to be more Irish, like Byrne and Farrell,
Yes.
and so on. Were those people members of the Church of Ireland, or were the alms given to anybody of any religion?
That's what we need to do a lot more work on that. I don't know. You'd suspect that it was both, wouldn't you? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to collect the money if it was, you know, if you collected money only for indigent Protestant poor. But then the almshouses often were for indigent Protestant poor. So it's hard to know. But I take your point that some of the names can be either, can't they? You know, they're not all just West Country names. You know, yeah.
Much more Anglo in the
Yes.
names and the wardens and so on.
Yes, exactly. Oh, yeah, very much so, isn't it? Yes, yeah.
Sorry, one more quick one.
Yeah.
There was 20% Irish on the slide you showed.
Yeah.
At what point do we know would that have built up to outnumber?
Yeah.
Is there any indication?
Well, I tell you, I'll give you, if you go to the end of the 18th century, and if you do Whitelaw survey, who did it's available online. It's on. You find it on Google Books for free. He did a density population in Dublin in 1798 now, so it's 50 years after we finished. But he talks about St Michael's Parish having 2,599 souls in it. Okay, in an acreage of it's 5 acres. Okay, so he's saying that basically there were 163 houses in the parish then, which gives a average of 15 persons per household. So it's dense enough, isn't it? You know what I mean? In the city, in 1798. So I suppose if you've got 15 people in a household, it could be 2 or 3 families, couldn't it? And if they're paying rent, and if that rent has been used to work out the valuation of the house. Is that the question you asked me? You asked me a different question altogether, I think.
When did the 20% of the Irish Catholics?
Oh yes, yeah. Oh, I think within I think I saw the reference somewhere by basically by 1709, 1710. It's half and half. You know they what they start coming back in. And I suspect a lot of them had just moved across the river during the Commonwealth period and were able to come back. You know what I mean? But it would be. I was very aware of that when I was doing this. That basically I can only tell you one half of the story, because the Catholic priests couldn't have been wandering around with Vestry Minute Books under their arms. They'd have been arrested or worse, So, and that's why you don't have the registers either, because, where would you keep them? And it would be dangerous to be with them. But it's interesting how the clergy come back in, and for example, Adam and Eve's, the Franciscan church on the Keys. It's called Adam and Eve's, of course, because there was a pub that you went in through to the church because it was away from the street. That's where it came from, Adam and Eve's. So it's a bit like that. Then the Pro Cathedral is not on the main street. It's the same idea. So there was accommodations, and that's what Rourke's map really shows. There were accommodations that were ignored. A lot of the time, and there was. I can't remember when it's at 1640s, I think, or 16 maybe. Anyway, the date of it's 17th century, where there was a conflagration. Is that the word? A huge fire in one of the mass houses in St Aldrin's Parish next door. Loads of people killed, and the Parliament said, "For God's sake, will you build them properly? We know they're there." So there was an accommodation. I think there were times, for example, during 1745, when you have the possibility of a Jacobite rebellion, things get a bit tense again. But if you're, and of course there was the whole issue. If I don't want to get carried away here now, but if you think about the New History of Ireland volumes that were done there 20 years ago, it was the most perfect country in the world. There was no religious conflict at all, if you read those books, because it was done after Vatican II, and everybody, historians are all they're talking about themselves, but they're looking at historical documents. It was the most perfect country in the world, and it's only when you get later historians sort of saying, well, no, it was never quite that nice, So I can't remember what. That's enough, is it?
We
They are, yeah.
And did you have to just keep going in there to?
I do a lot of work there anyway. So I digitized that volume, and then I put it through a thing called Transcribus, which is AI software that's able to read handwriting. So it does about 8% of a page for you. But then it started. If you're looking at a blank page, you'd be gone out for a walk. You wouldn't spend your day transcribing it, whereas if the machine does it and you fix it. The earlier ones that I showed you, they were all done by hand, I'm sure, or else they got students who do them for them, I don't know. But this one, it's using, it's burning up a rainforest somewhere, firing up an AI engine, but,
And when do you hope your volume will be?
Hopefully next year. I mean, it's going to be published here. The other series was done with Four Courts in conjunction with the Orby Library. But I persuaded Dublinia here that we need this one because it's in our parish here, for want of a better word. And, we could publish it here and make it available. The others are all available. I presume they're all in libraries that you occasionally turn up in bookshops, but they're certainly in the libraries. And I mean, when I was preparing this lecture, I went through and read the introductions again for the fun, but they're great. You know what I mean? Because you get a sense of what all the other parishes are doing. But there's great history in them, but you have to use several different lenses to pull out what's in them,
So, folks, we might just leave it there. Please put your hands together once more for Mike. Fantastic. That concludes our autumn lecture series. Thank you very much for your attendance, and we'll see you in the new year. So, thanks so much. Cheers, Mike.